There is always more than one factor that contributes to the outcome of an air disaster. This is one accident that really speaks for itself. It's a stunning tale of how one small mistake birthed from the need to navigate a perceived threat from an old design flaw, how a simple accident quickly transformed into something truly monstrous. What happened here is, in every sense of the word, horrific. Pure terror. And none of it had to happen. It's 7 in the morning on Sunday, July 5th, 1970. The crew of Air Canada Flight 621 are preparing for a transcontinental flight across North America, from Montreal to Los Angeles, with a stopover in Toronto. The 3 flight crew members are running through pre-flight checks. Whilst in the cabin, the 6 flight attendants were greeting passengers, helping them into their seats and preparing the galley. A total of 100 passengers were booked onto Air Canada 621 that morning. Some were only going as far as Toronto. Others were in for the long haul, and even some were expecting to transit onward once reaching LA. One of those passengers was Montreal restaurant owner Mansing Wong, traveling with his wife and their 11-year-old granddaughter Susie. Their final destination was San Francisco. They were flying out to spend time with family. Also on the flight were a set of twin sisters, Luella and Linda Earle. They were student nurses and worked in a hospital. Their journey was purely for pleasure, to get away for a 2-week vacation. They were expected to leave the aircraft in Toronto before connecting onto another flight, heading onward to the United States. Not everyone was traveling for pleasure. Claude Holliday was a representative at the Bell Telephone Company. He was strictly traveling on business. It's easy to forget when you're sat in your tiny airplane seat that there are dozens, if not hundreds of other people around you, all of them with their own stories, and hasn't everyone got a place to be? The aircraft they boarded was a brand new Douglas DC-8-63. Douglas had merged with McDonnell Aircraft just a few years previously, and this plane, technically now a McDonnell Douglas DC-8, rolled off the Long Beach production line in April of that year. This variant of the DC-8 was a stretched version of the previous models, and for a time in the mid-1960s, this was actually the highest capacity aircraft on the market. The accident aircraft, Charlie Foxtrot Tango India Whiskey, was delivered to Air Canada where it had logged just 453 flight hours before its loss on July 5th. Photographer Terry Waddington took this photograph of the accident aircraft just a matter of months before the accident. It is the only photograph we have of the accident plane before its loss, taken at the Douglas plant in Long Beach. The accident aircraft is seen here, pictured alongside other DC-8s. The other photographs of the aircraft which have been known to exist have since become lost media. Introducing Captain Peter Hamilton. At 50 years of age, he joined Air Canada in 1946, following a stint in the Canadian Air Force during World War II. Like many senior pilots of this era, he navigated his career through the massive transformation the aviation industry found itself in during this post-war period. By the time of the accident, he had achieved just short of 19,000 flight hours, a very impressive career, with around 2,900 of those logged in the DC-8. The captain was well rested. In fact, this was his first day back at work following a 4-day break. The first officer was same, really. 40-year-old Donald Rowland also had a military background and was hired by Air Canada in 1957, accumulating more than 7,000 flight hours at the airline, with around 5,500 logged in the DC-8. And like Captain Hamilton, First Officer Rowland was also well rested. In fact, he and his wife had recently arrived back home following a vacation in the United Kingdom. There was a third member of flight crew on the DC-8 that day, the second officer fulfilling a flight engineer's role. Gordon Hill was the youngest of the men. At age 28, he was much less experienced with around 1,300 total flight hours. Much like the other flight crew members in the cockpit that day, he too was also coming into work after some time off. He spent the day before the accident flight doing housework as he had recently moved. The pilots were all familiar with each other, especially Captain Hamilton and First Officer Rowland. They had flown together many times and often discussed various aspects of flight and aviation during their time together in the cockpit. And that will turn out to be a key point of interest in this accident. That is to say, what was later discovered on the cockpit voice recorder would trigger the curiosity of investigators. With all passengers and luggage loaded and pre-flight checks complete, the DC-8's 4 JT3D engines were fired up. Air Canada Flight 621 left Montreal at 7 in the morning on July 5, 1970. In total, 109 passengers and crew were on board. It's a journey of around 1 hour at a distance of 300 miles to Toronto. Captain Hamilton was pilot flying for this leg. The journey itself was mostly routine and uneventful. Though there was some cloud in the sky, that day was otherwise a perfect day for flying with good visibility. Cockpit voice recorders were still sort of new at the time. In 1970, most recorders had a capacity to record about 30 minutes of audio onto a tape that would then re-record over itself. The cockpit voice recorder transcript of Flight 621 begins 32 minutes and 39 seconds before disaster. The recording begins with First Officer Rowland making a radio call to Toronto Centre, relaying their altitude having just leveled off at 27,000 feet. Captain Hamilton was casually chatting with the other pilots about his time off. With nothing untoward, the flight was totally routine, for the most part. I say it like that because there was one interesting occurrence on this flight that, though worth mentioning, didn't really have much influence on the disaster sequence that follows. At 29 minutes to disaster, the cockpit voice recorder picked up a flight attendant entering the flight deck. She gave the pilots an interesting update. In the cabin, there was one passenger sitting in a left side window seat. They happened to be a ground worker for Air Canada, and they observed from their window that an access panel on engine number 1 was missing, that is, the outermost left engine. Though this occurrence surprised the pilots, it wasn't much of a concern. Conversation quickly turned to how they'll switch planes once landing in Toronto. They get on the radios and message Air Canada regarding the missing panel. Though the loss of the panel is not detrimental to the aircraft in any way, it would still have to be grounded and repaired before being released again. Flight 621 was already in its descent into Toronto. A southerly approach would be used this morning, with Flight 621 coming in for a landing on runway 32. We obviously don't have clear satellite data of the airport from 1970, so I have highlighted here on a modern image which runway this is. It is known today as runway 33 right. To be specific, they were given what is known as a back-course localizer approach. A back-course localizer approach is basically just a standard instrument approach, but using the localizer in reverse. Usually, the front course of the localizer is facing toward an aircraft on landing, but it can be navigated from behind, and that is what was done here. 10 minutes from landing, Flight 621 passes by downtown Toronto. From here, they will turn onto a base leg for 3 miles before making their final turn for runway 32. When investigators later listened to the cockpit voice recording, the approach up till this point was completely normal. In 1970, there were no rules around what pilots may know today as the sterile cockpit rule. This meaning that conversations between flight crew members under 10,000 feet must pertain to the operation of the aircraft only, although this may more generally extend to busy phases of flight. As was the case at the time, the pilot sort of continued to engage in conversations, whereas that probably wouldn't be allowed today. Most of what was said is not pertinent to the discussion on the accident, instead relating to company talk or Toronto's expensive housing market. Interwoven into all of this was aviation stuff, switching radios, navigation, and performing checklists and the sorts. Turning onto final, attention was drawn to the before landing checklist, and it's here where investigators would later focus interest. Investigators would have heard, listening into the tape as the pilots began running through the steps. We need to establish a baseline understanding here. The following is the before landing checklist. Landing gear control lever, down. Landing lights, extend and check as required. Altimeters, set. Landing gear, lever down, 3 green lights, 4 pressures check. Spoilers. Armed. Investigators would have then expected to hear this checklist be performed exactly to the points as detailed here. Except, they didn't. Investigators could account for most of these checklist items. For example, they heard the landing gear lever being lowered followed by a noticeable clunk, expected during the landing gear extension process. First Officer Rowland then commented, "Check, 3 green, 4 pressures. This is normal in reading back the response from the plane in regard to the checklist." But then he said, "Spoilers, on the flare." Captain Hamilton then responded, "Okay, brakes 3 green, 4 pressures, spoilers, on the flare?" First Officer Rowland jumps back in. "No, or on the ground?" "Alright, give them to me on the flare, I've given up, I'm tired of fighting it," said Captain Hamilton as the first officer chuckles. So, what the heck are they talking about? Here's the deal, the checklist specifically called for the spoilers to be selected to the armed position, before landing. It's in the before landing checklist. So, what's going on here? Let's talk really quick about what the spoilers are, as this is an important point in the narrative. Spoilers are wing devices that exist to reduce the lift output from a wing. You can see them in action yourself as a passenger. You look out of the window on landing and you can see them rising up from the surface of the wing once you are on the ground. That's the key part here. They tend to deploy on the ground. Although that is not to say that they can't be used in the air. They can if directed by the pilot. In many modern airplanes, the spoilers or speed brakes can be used to increase rate of descent, for example. The Douglas DC-8 specifically has a very interesting spoiler system. It's not like those other planes. The main use of the DC-8's spoilers is for ground use, to kill the lift on touchdown, translating into full weight on the landing gear. In flight, the 3 outboard spoilers on each wing can be deflected to assist in translation across the roll axis. They are linked to the ailerons for this purpose, but nominally speaking, aside from this, they are strictly ground use only. The ground spoilers themselves only becoming energized once the landing gear is lowered. As for in-flight speed brake functionality on the DC-8, that was actually served by deployment of reverse thrust on the inside engines. As we just mentioned, each wing has 3 outboard spoilers, but both wings also have 2 inboard spoilers, ground spoilers together making a total of 10 spoiler tabs that deflect into the airflow. All 10 simultaneously deploy on touchdown. But how exactly is that done? For the longest time, a mechanical system has been employed on most passenger planes to automatically deploy the spoilers once the wheels touch the ground. From the pilot's POV, that is done by selecting the spoilers or speed brake lever, depends on the aircraft, to the armed position. In the case of the DC-8, the ground spoiler controls are located on the right side of the throttle console. It's hard to miss, it's bright yellow. The ground spoiler lever can exist in one of 2 states, retract and extend, rather self-explanatory. For most of the flight, the lever will be left in the retracted, stowed, neutral position. Bringing the lever into the extend region obviously deploys the spoilers. But there is a third option, armed, which is done by lifting the lever. To be clear, when the spoilers are set to armed, that doesn't mean they've been deployed. It just means they've been pre-armed, primed to deploy once the main undercarriage landing gear touches the ground. Specifically, a combination of sensors interprets compression on the landing gear and significant wheel spin as the checks needed to initialize the mechanical function and raise the spoilers. So, knowing that, let's go back to the accident flight and have another look at what the pilot said in relation to the arming of the spoilers. We know the before landing checklist called for the spoilers to be selected to the armed position. However, the pilots, as we can see on the cockpit voice recording transcript, didn't really follow the checklist item as it was noted here, instead choosing to arm them later on the flare. Let's explore why the pilots may have done this. Here's the thing, this aspect of the accident touches upon a broader conversation among DC-8 pilots at the time. Despite the checklist requiring the spoilers to be armed earlier in the approach when the landing gear is lowered, some pilots were of divided opinion on this. The reason being that there was a fear of uncommanded in-flight spoiler deployment. Such an occurrence on approach could cause a stability upset, reducing lift at a critical phase of flight. Now there are a number of things that we need to keep in mind here. Firstly, This all likely came from previous incidents relating to in-flight spoiler deployment on the DC-8. Captain Hamilton himself was aware of such incidents. One case involving a Scandinavian Airlines DC-8 in Norway, it was confirmed he had known about. Curiously, he had also, incorrectly, attributed the crash of a Canadian Pacific DC-8 in Tokyo a couple of years previously to in-flight spoiler deployment, but that's a story for another time. Secondly, as word spread that the ground spoilers could be deployed in flight, there was a hesitancy among pilots on arming the spoilers earlier in the approach, as once they were selected to armed, there was little preventing them then becoming deployed. Electrical malfunction had been known to do this, for example. Douglas had tried to address this by introducing redundancies on later models, like that of the accident aircraft, installing extra layers of defense against potential in-flight spoiler deployment. However, this did little to quash the fear of the spoilers that pilots had, so Captain Hamilton and other pilots preferred to just forego arming the spoilers and deploy them manually themselves once on the ground, effectively removing the spoilers from the before landing checklist. Thirdly, Douglas had outlined in official documentation that a mechanical system was present on the aircraft that would prevent the spoiler lever from being brought into the extend region anyway, this being linked to the extension of the nose landing gear, which is important because it was with the landing gear extension that the spoilers become energized. So a mechanical locking would ensure that in-flight spoiler deployment would be prevented. Right? Well, take what I've just said there and keep it in the back of your head for now. This might be important later. Deploying the spoilers manually on touchdown was just one unofficial workaround for pilots. Captain Hamilton was not alone here. First Officer Rowland also felt uncomfortable arming the spoilers earlier in the approach, though his method differed slightly. He did prefer to arm the spoilers to at least conform somewhat with Air Canada's rules, but he would do so on the flare, that being the phase just before touchdown where the nose is raised and the plane is eased onto the runway. So that is where this conversation stems from. There was a slight difference in preference between these two pilots here, and it was something that they would have discussed extensively. In fact, it was known that these two pilots, when flying together, agreed to adhere to the practice desired by the pilot flying. So, when First Officer Rowland was flying, Captain Hamilton would arm the spoilers on the flare as per his preference, and likewise the other way around, when Captain Hamilton was flying, First Officer Rowland would deploy them on touchdown as per his preference. Though they may have disagreed here, it wasn't in an argumentative sort of way, but rather as a well-meaning professional preference. Captain Hamilton preferred to deploy the spoilers on touchdown, whilst First Officer Rowland preferred to arm them on the flare. So, when the captain says, "Alright, give them to me on the flare, I've given up, I'm tired of fighting it," this is him, as he was the one flying, conceding to the First Officer's preference to try out his method of doing it. Okay, so now that we have established the relevant context around the spoiler situation, let me tell you, none of this explains how the plane actually crashed. What this is setting the scene, preparing the moment for what might be a contender for the most devastating, honest mistake that has ever occurred in the flight deck of any aircraft in aviation history. That mistake was just moments away. Moving on in the approach, the crew of Flight 621 continued with their landing preparations. They contacted Toronto Tower and established themselves on the back course. They bring out the flaps, configuring the aircraft for landing. The landing checklist was complete, aside from the spoilers. Second Officer Gordon Hill reminded them of that. Flight 621 is number 1 for landing, but there was another aircraft on runway 32. As visibility was good that day, they watched at a distance as a Boeing 727 powered up its engines. The pilots comment on its departure. As the 727 leaves the runway, Air Canada 621 receives the landing clearance. 3 minutes and 10 seconds to disaster. The DC-8 enters the airspace above the airport grounds and reaches overhead the runway threshold for runway 32 at an altitude of just 60 feet. Captain Hamilton then utters a simple, "Okay." First Officer Rowland reaches for the spoiler lever, wanting to select it to the armed position in the flare as had been agreed. However, he, by mistake, pulled the lever into the extend position. The spoilers on the wings had been commanded to deploy, and all 10 of the aircraft's spoiler tabs rise up from the surface. Lift generation on the wings was killed, interrupted, causing an abrupt increase in rate of descent towards the ground. The DC-8 begins to rapidly sink. It would take just 3 seconds from spoiler deployment to ground contact. In that very short space of time, the rate of descent increased to a maximum of 1,500 feet per minute. It only took 2 seconds for the first officer to notice the mistake. He exclaims, sorry, Pete." He knew what had happened and was immediately apologetic. A lot can be said as to why he might have done this. One theory that has been put forward was the first officer was used to fully deploying the spoilers manually on touchdown when he was flying with Captain Hamilton. So think of it in a lapse of judgment, muscle memory took over and he inadvertently did the same here. It didn't help that the spoiler control lever could be very easily moved. Earlier DC-8 variants exhibited significant resistance on the ground spoiler lever. Douglas changed this so that less force was needed to move it on the newer model. Captain Hamilton also noticed the mistake and applied full power on all 4 engines. He pulls back on the control wheel with all of his strength to counter the sudden sink. He does manage to reduce the rate of descent, however it was too late. At 8:06 in 36 seconds, less than 3 minutes to disaster, Flight 621 makes its first contact with the ground, at a rate of descent of about 1,000 feet per minute. The DC-8 doesn't crash, but makes an exceptionally hard landing. Now a lot happened in this moment, so let's break it down. The main undercarriage landing gear obviously touched the ground first, but with a lean to the right. Investigators would later find that the landing gear had not sustained much damage from the hard landing itself. This is despite the vertical load factors far exceeding the DC-8's design limits. What did happen though was the loads were transferred to the wings, causing flexing and structural damage. Engine pylon 3, engine pylon 4, engine 4 itself, and a section of the underside of the wing sustained severe damage. The damage inflicted on this region punctures the number 4 alternate fuel tank inside of the wing itself, causing massive leakage. Flight 621 scrapes the ground for about half a second before Captain Hamilton is able to bring the plane back into the air, effectively performing a touch and go. Engine 4, its pylon structure, and some of the plating from the underside of the wing was left behind on the runway. Flight 621 had only taken 3 of its 4 engines back into the air, along with a severe fuel leak. This, to be blunt, shouldn't have been allowed to happen. The DC-8, like other planes, had been designed in a way to allow for clean breakage of the engine pods from the wings in events of extreme stress. This was supposed to be achieved by focusing excessive stress on the attachment points of the engine pylon that would take these loads and break away, but the attachment bolts did not perform that way. They didn't break, therefore not allowing for a clean separation of the engine. It was for this reason that investigators would make note that the aircraft structure did not perform as prescribed. Instead, the stress was transferred through the wings, which allowed for the devastation of the wing structure, rupturing the fuel tank. It took a measurable amount of time for the spoilers to retract completely, but once the aircraft was back in the air, the pilots began to collect themselves and observe the situation. Captain Hamilton tries to position his aircraft in a controlled climb, but is noticing a tendency of the aircraft pulling to the right. With the departure of the number 4 engine, there is now less drag on the right wing in addition to significant thrust asymmetry. He comments, "We've lost our power." Toronto Tower had obviously noticed that Flight 621 had bounced and was climbing again. Eyewitnesses reported flames trailing from the right wing, as fuel was now pouring out from the ruptured fuel tank. That streaming fuel passed through a number of heat and ignition sources. Hot air and damaged electrical wiring ignited the fuel, resulting in a trail of fire streaming from the aircraft. In the tower's transmissions to the stricken flight, they make no immediate remark informing them of their missing engine, fuel leak, or fire. Instead, they are simply handed off to a departure controller with an instruction to turn to the right. Without knowing this critical information, the flight crew couldn't adjust their response to their situation. To be honest, the pilots were initially optimistic. Captain Hamilton even commented that once they go around, they'll be alright. It was a false sense of security. When Captain Hamilton initiated the go-around, he had no idea to what extent the damage was to his plane. All of the crew were oblivious to the fact that their right wing was on fire. Some passengers sitting on the right side of the aircraft, if they were sitting in the front, they would have had a clearer view of the missing number 4 engine. Others may have been able to see the flames trailing from the damaged region. However, from the cockpit, they have no clear view of the wounded wing. Captain Hamilton brings the aircraft up to 3,000 feet of altitude and contacts Toronto departure. Flight 621 radios their intention to make another landing attempt on runway 32. However, by this point, the airport had closed the runway as debris was confirmed on the ground. There was no mention it was their debris, their own engine. 1 minute to disaster. Flight 621 is still flying away from Toronto Airport. Further flight control difficulty ensues as Captain Hamilton now correctly believes they have lost number 4. There was talk on trying to cut the fuel flow to the now non-existent engine, but they soon found difficulty in managing engine 3. 30 seconds to disaster. Flight 621 has been back in the air for about 2.5 minutes. The sound of crackling echoes throughout the aircraft. First Officer Rowland comments, "What was that?" he says. The plane is beginning to fall apart. Seconds later, the devastated fuel tank in the tip of the right wing explodes. It's the first of 3 explosions. The skin of the wing and other structural elements begin to separate. The explosion itself was loud enough to not only be heard on the flight deck, but also on the ground. It drew attention from residents as they heard a catastrophic boom above their homes. Perhaps now sensing imminent demise, First Officer Rowland again apologizes. "Pete, sorry," he says. Before anyone in the cockpit could say anything else, the second explosion destroys the entirety of the right wingtip, causing massive damage to the adjacent fuel tanks and number 3 engine pylon. Engine 3 separates from the aircraft. Those on the ground watch in sheer horror as the aircraft is consumed in a plume of black smoke. Stunned controllers radio to check in with Flight 621. They receive no response. The cockpit voice recording was still live. The third explosion destroys almost all of the right wing, and with that the plane becomes unflyable. Massive lift asymmetry lifts the left wing and the plane overbanks to the right. There was absolutely nothing anyone could do to stop the plane from crashing. The pilots sort of knew what had happened. The final entry on the CVR transcript before its abrupt end was, "We've lost a wing." Flight 621 enters its final plunge, spiraling to its fate. Air Canada Flight 621 crashed into what was farmland at the time, nearby to the town of Brampton. The aircraft was completely obliterated on impact, shattering into countless tiny fragments. Residents in the area were amongst the first to arrive on scene. There was no sign of life. All 109 people on board perished in the accident. There was nothing left even remotely recognizable as being part of an airplane. In fact, one of the only recognizable objects found at the site was a child's doll, believed to have belonged to 8-year-old Wendy Weinberg. This unsettling photograph was taken by one Boris Bremo. He was one of the first members of the media at the accident site that day. News of the crash stuns Canada. It's one of the worst air disasters in the country's history. An inquiry into the disaster was opened and investigators descended on the accident site. The area was beyond devastated. Parts of the plane were buried deep in the ground. It was a tough time for investigators. The accident site, though, has undergone massive changes since then. So, before we touch upon the final piece of the puzzle, let's take a closer look at the story of the crash site. Over the decades that followed, many cities across North America underwent massive suburban expansion. The Toronto region was no exception. Eventually, the crash site was set to be redeveloped into suburban housing, and this is the crash site today. I decided to fly out to Toronto to visit the crash site and the memorial for myself. This is Purple Lilac Memorial Park. It only officially gained that name in 2020, marking 50 years since the disaster. It's located on the outskirts of Toronto, surrounded by those suburban homes. Just 15 years or so ago, none of this was here, it was farmland. Eventually, suburban sprawl caught up to the crash site and efforts were made to make sure the history of what happened here was preserved in memory. The memorial was completed and opened in 2013. The garden here is only small, but features a clearing that leads out into a wider field. It was this field, along with the wider surrounding area, where you could often find plane parts, sometimes human remains. I did take the time to walk through the field myself, however you will likely not find any plane parts here today. When the area was developed, foundations obviously needed to be set, with installations of a wide range of utilities which would have cleared up much of the remaining fragments of wreckage. As you walk into the garden, you are greeted with this information stand that gives you a background of why this area is of significance, giving a visitor a quick rundown of the accident, even if they did get some of the details wrong. In the garden, there is a plaque here with the names of the victims. The plaque is fitted to a large boulder, and I have been informed that these boulders were sourced from the accident site when the plane cratered into the earth. The main striking feature of this site, though, is what is on the ground. 109 small pink polished granite pyramids decorate the site. Each one represents one of the lives lost in the accident. What is really touching, though, is that they are all arranged into the many different travel groups. Where you see one lighter square on its own, that represents a solo traveller or a member of crew. One of these could have been Claude Holiday travelling on business. Here was a group of 4, possibly a family. There are couples or sisters like the Earl twins. Here was a group of 3, which could have been the Wong family. One heartbreaking detail here is that I read that 11-year-old Susie was brought on the flight because her grandparents felt they would have missed her too much during their trip. Looking over the passenger manifest, you may notice there are 2 groups of 5, 2 families of 5 in fact, and here they are. This really is a beautiful garden. It is open and enjoyed by local members of the public. Whilst I was there, the place was visited by many other people. It's a meeting place for a chat with friends or to take the dog for a walk. It took a long time for a memorial like this to come to fruition. For some of the victims' relatives, it was a sense of closure. Air Canada drew a lot of criticism as, according to some of the relatives of the lost, the airline seemed to have little interest in what happened in the years since the accident. Air Canada distanced themselves from the disaster, creating a disconnect between them and those relatives. They had felt forgotten. In a way, being here reminded me of being stood on Miller Field on Staten Island. The suburban landscape not only strikes a similar chord, but once again there was that distant sound of jet engines. And sure enough, planes fly right over the crash site today. When the inquiry into Flight 621 was launched, they aimed to truly get to the bottom of what happened. In this video, we have already explored what happened in the accident itself, and even established why DC-8 pilots at Air Canada may have disregarded the checklist in relation to the arming of the ground spoilers. However, we still have some unfinished business to take care of. Investigators took a closer look at the design of the DC-8 and its spoiler system. What they wanted to know was how could the spoilers be deployed in flight in the first place. On the DC-8, they are called ground spoilers, because they serve no real in-flight purpose. They are only supposed to be deployed on the ground. So, how was the first officer able to make that fateful mistake in the first place? This was particularly confusing, as Douglas had led airlines, pilots, and investigators into believing that an interlocking system would prevent inadvertent deployment of the spoilers in flight. But it turns out that wasn't true. The ground spoilers could actually be deployed in flight. Not that any pilot would willingly do that. However, that doesn't matter when we're talking about a pilot doing exactly that by mistake. Not only could this be done, but the supposed mechanical prevention that was said to have been on the DC-8 didn't actually exist. Take a look at this quote from the DC-8 operations manual published by Douglas themselves. It read,
Normally, the lever is prevented from going to the extend position while in flight by a mechanical system operated by extension of the nose landing gear strut.
Investigators' comments regarding this quote in particular are rather interesting.
This is a false statement. In no DC-8 owned by Air Canada does such a mechanical system exist to prevent the lever from going to the extend position.
Similarly, a number of operations manuals that were distributed internally among the different DC-8 operators also revealed similar inaccuracies regarding the spoilers. Airlines, when they made their own versions of these manuals, they just sort of copied what the manufacturer had said. However, it was found that whoever wrote these technical details did not really understand the complexities of the DC-8, or that is when it comes to the spoilers at least. It was either that or Douglas just lied about the existence of this locking mechanism. This brings into question the role of the Federal Aviation Administration. How could they certify official documentation that contained something that didn't really exist on the plane at all? In a way, what had happened here was this sort of copying enabled the proliferation of information that was untrue about the aircraft. This manifesting in pilots altering the before landing checklist out of distrust that their plane won't behave in the way prescribed. The inquiry suggested that airlines like Air Canada should have done their part in auditing what Douglas had outlined and corrected these inaccuracies. This misinformation wasn't just limited to the flight manuals, it spread to pilot training as well. Despite the ground spoilers being an obvious topic of interest for DC-8 pilots at Air Canada, investigators found that Air Canada's training staff did not know about the potential deployment of the ground spoilers in flight. The complete lack of awareness of this manifested in another notable in-flight spoiler incident. In 1973, Loftleidir Flight 509, an Icelandic-operated DC-8, suffered substantial damage following a hard landing at New York's Kennedy Airport. Though this case was non-fatal, the similarities to Air Canada 621 are shocking. The Icelandic captain, one Olaf Olsen, the most Nordic name I've ever seen in my life, he had employed the unofficial on-the-flare procedure when it came to the arming of the ground spoilers. And much like the Air Canada disaster, they had inadvertently deployed the spoilers instead of arming them. Deployed at an altitude of about 40 feet above the ground, the plane sank and struck the runway tail first. When the NTSB investigated the accident, they made it clear that the DC-8's design did not protect against this kind of accidental human error. They made direct reference to Air Canada 621 and argued that further action was required. After all, the fact that it had happened again was going to threaten more lives if nothing was done. A modification to the DC-8 to prevent in-flight spoiler deployment was mandated, along with the installation of a caution plaque warning pilots against deployment of the ground spoilers in flight. Not that it matters much today, the DC-8 is basically, for lack of a better word, extinct. Nonetheless, these sorts of accidents do highlight the importance of pilots following procedures. It's such a strict part of pilot training these days that it would be unthinkable to deviate from the checklists. Still, it is remarkably sad how an issue that had been known about for years before the loss of the Air Canada flight was never really addressed. It's a haunting reminder that, where necessary, we should be proactive, so that lives are not so needlessly lost. During the making of this video, I often thought about First Officer Donald Rowland. During the crisis, it's rather clear that he blamed himself for all of this. However, for what it's worth, Air Canada 621 is a classic case of what was said at the very first line of this video. Now, if you enjoy these sorts of videos, you might have an interest in airplanes and how they work, the technical side, the engineering side. Well, that's where this video's sponsor comes in, Brilliant. Brilliant brings you the courses you need to get learning more about subjects related to maths, data analysis, computer science, programming, engineering, and more. Brilliant is where you learn by doing. They feature thousands of interactive, hands-on classes crafted by an award-winning team of teachers, making Brilliant the most effective way to learn. It helps you build problem-solving and critical thinking skills, allowing you to build real knowledge not just from memorizing. For example, Brilliant recently launched a ton of new content in data using real-world datasets to train you to see trends and make better informed decisions, perfect for learners of any level. Check out their Predicting with Probability course, which lets you work with real air traffic data. To help you grow as a learner, Brilliant encourages you to learn a little every day so you develop a new, positive, and powerful daily learning habit. This is one of the most important things you can do, both for professional and personal growth. With lots of fun lessons you can do whenever you have the time, it's way better than the alternative of mindlessly scrolling. Try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. Visit brilliant.org/disaster breakdown or click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. So that's brilliant.org/disaster breakdown and start learning today. Tell them Chloe sent you. A big thank you to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Hi everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so that you can stay tuned for the next one. A big thank you to my friend Rosalind who supplied some of the background music for this video. I'll drop a link to her channels in the description. Also, a thanks goes out to friend of the show Kira, otherwise known as Admiral Cloudberg, a total legend in air accident analysis, who was kind enough to lend her voice for a few lines in this episode. And I will drop her links, including one to her podcast, in the description too. This was a case I have been meaning to cover on the channel for a long time. I decided to make the trip to Canada. I mean, why not at this point, considering I went to New York and Malaga. I just about covered everything I wanted to in this video. I am very much a perfectionist and I always go back to try and make sure I've, covered everything I want to get, and sometimes I just have to call it, and this is one of those times. One interesting thing though, remember early on in this episode where I mentioned about that one image being the only one we have of the plane? Well, as it stands right now, that is true. However, I did mention that other photos of the plane did exist, now lost media. Those images were taken during the crash sequence, seconds before the plane impacted the ground. We know they existed because the film was handed over. If these images are ever discovered, they could be amongst the most stunning aviation photographs ever taken. Same level as the American 191 photograph and Ethiopian 961 video. So, if you are a lost media kind of person, like me, I would love to track these down, and I will leave a link to more details in the description and pinned comment. Anyway, it is that time, the end of the video. I must take a moment to thank my amazing patrons over on Patreon for their amazing support to the channel. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if your name is here, a massive thanks to you. And we've got a few more shoutouts to do today. So, in business class, in order of which they joined, a thank you to Indira Sanchez, John Lavalley, and Emily Casey. And first class, a massive thanks goes out to Doug Bramley and Cinemike. I hope I said that right. Thank you all so very much, I really appreciate it. Legends. If you yourself would like to support the channel further and have your name featured at the end of the next video, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all new videos at least 2 days before they go out publicly on YouTube. If you want to stay connected with me, I mainly post on Twitter, so my link to that will be in the pinned comment also. And that is all from me today. Thank you all so much for watching, have a great day, and I will see you next time. Goodbye! Why did I wave? I did it again! Dude! My dude. There is a fucking snake here. Alright, yeah, I'm out of here.